The next large ensemble piece that I made was in 2012, and that piece was called Motherland. It's since toured to America and all over the UK and Edinburgh, and has been a very successful ensemble piece of work. It's the largest piece I've made. It has 10 people in it. It has live music, has a big set, and it's quite a striking, stark piece of work. The conceptual starting points for Motherland were, again, several really. One was looking at the idea of segregating the sexes and having the men do certain things and the women do certain things, and looking again at that interplay between the genders. The other thing was looking at motherhood and infertility and women's bodies and what we carry around. So again, sort of leading on from some of the thoughts in Traces of Her and some of my own experience in making If We Go On. And Aurora having now 2 children, and Alex and Andrea having a child together, and kind of clocking where we were all at in our personal lives, and sort of looking at how to translate that into a show about fertility, really. And we looked at fertility in the widest sense, in terms of women's bodies carrying children or not, but also folk dance and earthiness, and what we can share from our past, and the kind of things that make us want to dance, the richness of expression as a kind of fertility, the opportunity to sing and dance as something that we can form a community from somehow. Anyway, we also, the third sort of strand, I suppose, for me, was an increasing dissatisfaction with the way that young girls and women are having to cope with the level of over-sexualisation in our culture, through the use of mobile phones and Facebook, and how we cannot be pure in a way anymore. We can't live without the influence of pornography. We can't live without the influence of body image being thrust in our faces all the time. And of course, the women that I work with are beautiful, and they're slim, and they're, fantastically talented. But I wanted to set that against a younger child who's trying to make sense of all that tits and arse, basically, that's involved in performance sometimes. And also the things that women have to cope with in their own bodies, that they have to carry: periods, miscarriages, inability to have children, ability to have children. And so a lot of the images in Motherland are about the physical acts. There's a lot of blood involved. There's Aurora with stuffing up her belly to make her look pregnant. There's slow motion fighting between the sexes as a sort of metaphor. It's funny, but it's a metaphor for when are we ever going to be able to speak the same language. We've got stories of Benita as an older woman, looking back at when she first had a child out of wedlock, how inappropriate that was in the 50s, and how that child was nearly taken away, put up for adoption, which she managed for it not to be. So really personal stuff, but put into a very stark, clinical, formal environment where, again, I suppose I continued from If We Go On, the lack of building up a narrative that keeps flowing. So Motherland is a series of episodes, a series of fragments that, when you see it as a 2-hour whole, builds up a picture that makes a kind of sense. But what you don't have is a neat hour-and-a-half narrative that takes you from A to B on an emotional journey. It's a stop, or just getting somewhere to stop. So there might be a beautiful solo that Andrea does around, Alex and Scott playing this beautiful music, but then it stops, it's gone. So moving on from If We Go On, it was instead of pauses, it was almost like I wouldn't allow any scene to develop into a full scene. And we used the phrase, I would cut it short, and the shock of something coming to an abrupt end, which I suppose for me, again, talking personally, was a metaphor for getting pregnant and then losing babies, is that you think you're on a journey to becoming a mum and then it stops. And so that, I suppose that's what I do a lot in my work, that what's going on for me bodily or mentally or emotionally, I can translate into a metaphor that's not a literal one. It's about the rhythm of something stopping. It's not about the content even. It's not explicit. It's about the rhythm or the patterns or the repetitions or the repeated images as a metaphor for something that's going on in my life, which at the time was something that happened, many times, multiple losses. And I suppose that was reflected in the work. And then, the joy of the women in the company who have had children and are parents, we tried to reflect that too. The act of making love was reflected in there. There were some really silly songs and silly dances, as there were in If We Go On as well. And in terms of the set design, a little joke for myself was that the controversiality, if that's the word, controversiality of If We Go On, with its darkness and its black set. Motherland's set is actually If We Go On set painted white, and that was a little in-joke to me about knowing that If We Go On was so hard for people to digest and stomach, and knowing that If We Go On, that Motherland would be hard to digest in another way, but more palatable, even though the content was very tricky in some respects. So the palette is very monochrome. It's white set, black and white costumes and shoes, wooden boxes. The boxes in Motherland are ammunition boxes, and again, it's quite an obvious metaphor for the battle between people that occurs. And some of the boxes are from Israel, and some are from America, and some of them are from, I think, Saudi Arabia or wherever, but they are real ammunition boxes. They have had bombs in them. They have been in warfare situations, and they're vintage articles from the Second World War mostly. So again, harking back to Drop Dead Gorgeous, really, where I was looking at bombs and war, there was a trace of that in Motherland, and those boxes were used to shift the visuality of the space. So the only colour in Motherland, apart from wood and the wooden instruments, the cello and the violin, was the redness of fake blood, and at one point very green grass, which is real grass, which again was a metaphor for things can grow out of this sterile wasteland. It was a different kind of sterility from the chaos of If We Go On. It was a blank page. And I suppose, the hope in Motherland is that even in a desert, a seed can grow. Even in a white clinical space, some grass can grow. And Andrea at one point puts that grass on her genitals and lies there prostate or prostrate, I always get that wrong, with a sense that even if you're losing things bodily as a woman from your vagina, things can still grow inside you, whether they're emotions or babies or the desire to have a child a different way. And so I think there is a tiny bit of hope in there. It's a very funny show. And again, it had text from Liz Agus in there. It had some influence from Wendy Houston in there. And a really striking ensemble of brilliant performers. And again, musically, I think it's very strong. In terms of my interdisciplinary approach, I think what was interesting making Motherland is that, as with some of the other work I've made, going back to Punch Drunk actually, where there was a band that formed, I invited Aurora to play rock guitar, which she's never done before, and the three women, Aurora, Andrea and Patrizia, who is a musician, all ended up singing a song that I wrote about what it's like to be a woman, how you have to please and be sexy at the same time, and all those sorts of contradictions. So, we've got visual artists and performers playing musical instruments that they've never played before. We've got musicians talking and telling jokes. We've got a set that is marked by patches of blood, and soil actually is the other thing that is introduced as this metaphor for growing things. So as the piece progresses, the white space is a canvas, if you like, that is marked over time. It's a long show, it's 2 hours with no interval. And the music leaves traces in the space, very much so, because there are some repetitions, and some of it's fierce music and some of it's incredibly beautiful. The soil leaves traces, the blood marks are marks on a wall and marks on the floor that start to look messier and messier. The other thing that Aurora particularly does in this show, as Patrizia has done in If We Go On and in Test Run, is use her voice to build a soundscape of baby noises as a mother, baby and parental noises that you make to soothe or encourage or somehow that are in the air when you have a child. And together with Scott and Alex, they build this incredible soundscape that Benita, the older lady, tells her stories to. So for me, what was really successful in Motherland was everybody playing to their strengths, but also people stepping outside of their comfort zones. You know, Aurora's never used her voice in my work before, and she's brilliant at it. So it's another example of sort of us saying to each other, what do we want to do that we haven't done yet? Let's not just repeat ourselves. Let's push ourselves out of our own comfort zones. And the way we made Motherland was very confusing for the performers. It was 10 weeks solid. It wasn't stretched over this long time like If We Go On, but we worked in Eastleigh, and because the set's quite larger than the rehearsal space, we used the fire doors and the entrance and exit doors of the studio as our wings. So what it meant was, while I was working on particular scenes or building up certain stuff that would become a scene, let's call it, people would be outside of the space. And we worked a lot on entrances and exits in a way that I've never done that in my work. I've avoided it because I feel it's a sort of cliche of proper theatre, that you come on and you do your thing and then you exit, stage left. And with all of the work that we've made as an ensemble, you come on stage and you stay on for the duration of the work and then you go off at the end. And with Motherland, I really wanted to play with what's it like if you come on and you do your thing, it gets cut short and then you have to go off again. That was really interesting compositionally and from a directing point of view, to build a show from fragments and repetitions. Like particularly the ladies come on, repeat a fall, repeat a blood splat, repeat a piece of violin, a fragment of violin, and then they cut it short and they go off. And the audience is sort of left with what was that? And something's left in the space, but we don't know why. It's almost like they came on and deposited stuff and then left, leaving us as the audience to make up our minds as to what that might mean or what it might signify. But what that meant for the performers is that they couldn't get a grasp in the making process, as couldn't I for quite a while, I have to admit, of what we were doing and how it stacked up as a whole, because their process, they couldn't see half of what was on the stage because they were off it, they couldn't feel it, they had their through line that they were trying to find, but it was a very shaky way to make a piece, but deliberately shaky. The result is a very, very strong composition that I created from the fragments that they created. The difficulty of the process for all of us was 10 people not quite knowing where the whole thing was going. So it was like a big ship that I was sort of sailing through very, very stormy waters, losing confidence myself at times about what I was doing. But I think the result is probably stronger than anything we've ever made before, because it's stark, it appears simple, but it's actually very layered. It's clinical and yet it's dirty. It's very in your face and confrontational in some ways, but also incredibly soft in others. It totally acknowledges the people that are watching you from the minute everybody introduces themselves. The first 10 minutes are the ensemble one by one coming on and just being seen, not doing anything but just standing and looking. And a lot of the feedback that we got from Motherland was how lovely to see, especially dancers who are usually leaping around and doing special things that no one else can do, to just come on and be seen, which in my mind was a sort of continuation of the pauses in If We Go On, where you just stop the action and you just are, so you be rather than do. And that's been a theme through my whole personal life and life as an artist, I suppose. At what point can you just be instead of doing? And it's quite a yogic thing, actually. Like, can you just be on the yoga mat rather than doing everything? You know, my approach to yoga is far too lacking in breath a lot of the time. I'm interested in it when I get around to it, doing it as a way to calm myself down rather than G myself up. And as a dancer, that's always a contradiction. Like, we use yoga a lot now as a group of older practitioners to prepare ourselves for being much more physical. So it's almost like even in the way we warm up is a contradiction. I mean, it's not everyone does that in the dance world, but we don't do the big dance numbers to warm up. We let the work warm us up now in a way we didn't 10 years ago. What I'm trying to say is we used to do big classes to get warm, but now we do some yoga, we do some stretching, and we talk a lot. And the work, I think, is more intellectually solid for that. Motherland has been very critically acclaimed as a piece of work. I think it's a mature piece of work with a mature ensemble the individuals of whom bring different skills and real panache, actually, into the mix. It was a very difficult process to make it. It's toured a lot. It's been put to bed now. And I think I've described this before, this process of sort of setting a conceptual framework, allowing a lot of play by the people that work on a show with me, and then closing it down. I think in this particular show, because people didn't have an understanding of what the whole would be until we performed it for the first time, it has broken a couple of relationships, namely the one with Alex Katona, who is a brilliant musician and has contributed a massive amount to Vincent Dance Theatre's work over the past 8 years. And I think after this process we've realised that we can't work together anymore because it's too hard to give that much freedom and then for me to have such strong opinions about where the music needs to go to serve the piece. And so that relationship has probably now come to an end. The relationship with his wife Andrea, I shouldn't really say that, should I? With Andrea, who's a woman in her own right, I really hope to work with her again because she brought something really special to Motherland. Really, she's very comic, she's a brilliant dancer, she's very open, she's a fantastic improviser. I'd love to work with her again. The 3 Poles are still in the mix, and hopefully I'll work with Scott Smith again. He's worked on several shows now. So that's an ongoing relationship. And what Motherland did for me, I suppose, because shortly after making and touring it for a year or so, I am now a mum. And what it signified really for me is the end of a kind of autobiographical need to mine my own experience to make work. And I just feel that really instinctively, really clearly, that this 20 years of making that's been based on my churning emotions and my life experiences has somehow come to an end. I'll probably eat these words in a couple of years, but what I've planned for the next 3 years, is actually widening out the stories, if you like, of the stories that I want to put on stage. So it's less about me and us as an ensemble and what we bring into the mix, but more about gathering a wider set of voices. I'm interested in looking at young men and young women in 2 separate environments for once. It's the first time in my career I'm intending to segregate the sexes so that there's a safe space for us to do quite in-depth research with those focus groups and create something that reflects their experiences.